couple of weeks ago, Pastor Mark asked me if I would speak today because they had a little trip planned or something like that. So I said yes, I would. And it's always, for me, to stand here where we have a pastor who proclaims the Word of God so strong and faithful to it. It's a little bit scary to get up here and follow in those footsteps. And I know that he trusts me, and I know that. But still, it's a little bit scary. And when he asked me, he said, "Would you mind giving something from an apologetics point of view?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it'd be fine. It'd be good." I teach apologetics at Legacy Christian Academy in Frisco, and I've been doing this for a little bit. And so thinking about it, I thought of the idea of doubting. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid growing up, it was, you'd hear the sermon. A lot of times I'd hear the sermons, and I knew that I was a born-again Christian, but I'd hear the sermons, and then, I don't know. I just don't know. And all the things. So what is doubt? Look in Mark chapter 9. If you go to Mark chapter 9 real quickly, it'll kind of introduce, this is where the man has a son that is demon-possessed is what it looks like, and he has convulsions, and he has everything else, and the disciples had a hard time trying to heal him and doing everything, and finally the father goes to Jesus and asks him that, "Could you do this?" And so Jesus asks him, "How long has this happened to him?" And he says, "From childhood." Then in verse 22, he says, "And many times it has thrown him into the fire or water to destroy him. But if you can do anything," he says, "have compassion on us and help us." Then Jesus said to him, "If you can?" And he said, "Everything is possible to the one who believes." Immediately the father of the boy cried out. Now get this. "I do believe." Then he says, "Help my unbelief." You ever feel that way? I believe most of the time. Help me with my unbelief. And a lot of that is, I think a lot of times we try to approach this stuff purely maybe from an emotional point or some different things like that. In Romans chapter 12, in verse 1, Paul said, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Think about that. And a lot of times we focus on the heart. And he says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And that's one of the things I think we neglect. And so in teaching a course all these years on apologetics, one of the things I find out is that there's a lot of stuff we just don't know. You know why we don't know? Because we hadn't taught it. You know why we hadn't taught it? Because we don't know it. I mean, it's just that way. So I'm going through these slides. Hopefully you can get through this. So I'm ready for everyone doubts. So we go to the next slide. Everyone doubts. So I like this little story. William Lane Craig, noted apologist, probably the world's leading apologist now, who stepped into the arena literally with the devil and debates and does a great job and really destroys every evidence or everything that the atheist has. Anyway, he tells the story of a pastor who had confessed to his congregation, a pretty good-sized church, one Sunday that he had been doubting the very existence of God. The pastor told the congregation that now those doubts had been resolved, and he felt a new confidence in the Lord. And then I like what Dr. Craig said. "I was so surprised by this admission. Who would have thought that this successful pastor of a burgeoning church had doubted that there is a God? I greatly respected him for his honesty. For what his testimony communicated to his people was that they should not be ashamed of their doubts when they had them, but they could admit them and work through them." The key of their word is work, and seek the help of their pastor who'd walked down that lonely road himself. So, who has doubts? So who has doubts? Well, everyone does. Everyone does at times. That means that I do. That means that atheists even doubt their atheism at times. So the question is, how do we react or how do we deal with the doubts we will or may have now? But first, let's look exactly what is the nature of all doubts, because all doubts are not the same. I like what Alistair McGrath, professor at Oxford, says. He says, doubt is an invitation to grow in faith. Think about that. Doubt is an invitation to grow in faith and understanding, rather than something we need to panic about or to get preoccupied with. We must all learn to grasp and value what Lord Tennyson calls the sunnier side of doubt. Now, it sounds like it's a little bit easier, but it's not. It's a tough task. So let's look at what doubting is and what doubting is not. So one of the things we know about doubts, that doubting is not what we would call skepticism. Because skepticism is the decision to deliberately doubt everything as a matter of principle. And so when you come into the skeptics, now that's one of the things that as I teach, and I'll have students and I'll even have parents come up and ask me questions. And one of the things I ask is when they give a difficult question, I said, are you seeking for answers or are you seeking for excuses? Do you see the difference? Are you searching for answers or are you just looking for something to disbelieve? And so what is it? So skepticism is that decision to deliberately doubt everything. And that's what you're going to do. And that's what we see with atheists. And that's what and I'll quote a few atheists along the way, and you'll see this. And then number two, doubt is not unbelief. It's not skepticism. Doubt is not unbelief. Unbelief is a decision not to have faith in God. Unbelief is an act of the will. We willfully say, I'm not going to believe, rather than it being a difficulty in understanding. Because there are a lot of things in Scripture that I come across and I say, wow, I don't know if I fully get this. But it shouldn't lead to my doubting whether or not something is true. I don't know. I can't explain all the miracles other than that they're miracles. And so unbelief is this act of the will and not just something that's difficulty in understanding. And so what we know is this, that faith and then doubting are not mutually exclusive. Faith and unbelief are mutually exclusive. So faith and doubt a lot of times go together, but faith and unbelief never go together. And so the idea of that. So Os Guinness calls doubt a divided heart, is what he says. Doubt is a divided heart. Now, the idea of doubt, the actual word, the Latin word for it that you have there, is rooted in a word that means two. Two, double. That's where we get the word double from. So to believe, the idea of believing is to be in one mind with Christ and trusting someone or something is true. So it's to be in one mind. It's one of the things that we understand. Now, again, many times I'll refer to the mind because that's what we've got to keep in our mind. So to doubt then is to waver between the two things, or to do this: I believe, I don't believe. I believe, I don't know if I believe, at once, and to be in not one mind, but to be in two minds. So that's what doubt is. And if you've ever doubted anything, and growing up, I grew up in a church that preached, and the pastor preached almost every Sunday. It was hellfire and brimstone, every Sunday. Not every Sunday, but it was that way in the Sunday morning. Why? Well, we had a lot of people that weren't Christian. And it was, okay, I believe, but do I really believe? And so we can have that divided heart to where I know this to be true, but then did I really do the right thing? Have I really done what's really good? And so faith and doubt, what Tennyson calls the sunnier side of doubt, absolute certainty is found only in a very small class of beliefs. For example, things that are self-evident self-evident are capable of being demonstrated by propositions. Now, propositions are just statements that you make that you're saying that they're true, or they could be false. For example, we all know this. We know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we don't even really have to think about it. We know 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4. Or we could have statements like this: the whole is always greater than the part. You know, if there's a pie, you know, and you want the whole pie, you know, if you could eat the whole pie, or like for me, you know, you get that half gallon of ice cream, you know, my wife will testify. When I get it, I don't want to share it. It's like my granddaughter used to say, it's mine's. Remember those days? Mine. And so I don't even need a bowl. You know, I just want it. I want all of it. So the whole is greater than part. I don't want part of it. I want it all, you know. So we must remember, and we're talking about faith. We're talking about doubt. We're talking about these things. We must remember that the aim of what we're going for is not necessarily absolute certainty. Look, because that's what it is. Remember what Paul taught us. And he said, Paul said that, okay, I just lost my train of thought with this. I'll come back to it in just a second. All right, so to believe in God does take an act of faith, but so does the decision not to believe in Him. So it's an act of faith for me to believe in God. But if you're not going to believe in God, or you're not going to believe that Jesus rose together, it also is an act of faith. For neither one of those is based in absolute certainty. There's an element of doubt in either one of those cases. And so keep that in mind. So faith is requisite. Faith is required. And so faith is not belief without proof, but it's trust without reservations. Now, I grew up in Garland. Can I hear an amen? Okay, there we go. So I grew up in Garland. When I grew up in Garland, school was a lot different than school is now. And one of the things is that we drilled, we did things, we wanted to know things, we had those things. I had teachers that were always good. And how many of you are willing and old enough to say you remember how you diagram sentences? Anybody ever diagram sentences? Yeah, it's good. You know, you can diagram sentences in Greek and all. And it's all. I mean, diagram sentences. When I was in the 5th grade, Mrs. Werner was my teacher, and she was one of the older teachers in the school. And school was changing at about that time. It was going from a time of when there was a classical understanding, and it was going more to a progressive. And I remember staying in from recess on more than one occasion and having to do extra work, and Mrs. Werner looking at me, and she'd almost start preaching to me. She'd say, Ronnie Littleton, I don't care what everybody says. You're going to diagram sentences. You're going to do the things. You're going to get into this. You're going to study. And I yes, ma'am. Had no idea what she was talking about. Now, as I became a teacher and I saw what was going on in education, it made sense. She was teaching me truth. She was making me diagram those sentences. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, and we think about this, and when I was 17 years old, and I was listening to my pastor preach, and my pastor was preaching, and he said, he was going through Hebrews, and he gets to Hebrews chapter 11, and he begins reading that, and the Old King James Version says it like this: Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. Now, being the nerd I am, when I was 17 years old, I picked out a piece of paper and I started just kind of scribbling, and what I did is I diagrammed the sentence. For the first time, faith began to make sense to me. I mean, going all the way back to elementary school, learning how to diagram sentences. And so, if you look at this, faith is two things. Look at it. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and then it's the evidence of things not seen. Now, it's not all your hope for, all the things, it's going to give you fuzzy feelings or anything. No, we got to find what is the substance? What is the evidence? There's substance all the way through this Word of God. There's evidence all the way through this Word. You know what a lot of us do? We neglect the Bible, then wonder why we have doubts. I mean, Guilty. I grew up that way. All right? So here's what faith is. It's a trust in God who has shown himself worthy of that trust. You get that? It's trust in God, and he's shown himself worthy of that trust. Now, I would say dying on the cross for my sins is a pretty good action that I can trust. And so, although it may seem many times to be a leap of faith that is involved in Christianity, it is not an irrational leap into the dark. Make sure you understand that. So all outlooks on life, all theories on the meaning of human existence rest on faith, in that they cannot be proved with absolute certainty. But that doesn't mean that they're all equally probable or plausible. Now, a lot of times people say, well, in Christianity, it just takes a lot of faith. And then they go off and they become Buddhist, or they become this, or they become... And I say, look, everything takes faith. If you're going to accept something as true, you're going to accept it on faith. And so, for example, here's an illustration by Dr. McGrath. He says, look at 3 theories on the significance of Jesus for illustration. Number 1, we've been redeemed from sin by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Number 2, Jesus and his disciples were actually an advance guard of a Martian invasion force who mistook Earth for the planet Venus on account of a navigation error. Number 3, Jesus was not really a person, but a hallucinogenic mushroom. Now, the illustration here, the illustration is to serve for us about the idea of faith and about understanding. That although no one or none can be proved or disproved with absolute certainty, okay, it is obvious that they cannot all be taken with the same degree of seriousness. Let me say that again. That it is obvious that they cannot all be taken with the same degree of seriousness, even though all of them may be put out there as they're true. So when we look at this, how do we discern? How do we do this? So what do we do? What do we do? Well, the real problem is not proving Christianity with absolute total certainty. The big questions concern, number 1, the reliability of Christianity's historical foundations. Can we look and see what the history of that is? And I tell you, the history of Christianity is solid. It is solid. Then number 2, the next thing, its rationality. Does it make sense? Its power to convert. We had a great illustration of it. We saw the baptism, buried in the likeness of his death, raised in the likeness of his resurrection. And the power to convert. And then finally, its relevance to human existence. Isn't it amazing that when we think about Christianity and what is it that Christians are doing? They're going into all the world preaching the gospel, and guess what they do? They bring food with them, they bring clothing, they do all the things that are doing. You know why? Because we are here to help people. Pastor Al, what does he do? I mean, just thinking about it, can y'all tell when he gets excited? I tell him he's got to have to let me know if you're excited about this or not. But why is it? Because what he's doing is he's showing it that this is what makes us better. You know, we're not perfect. It's the love of Christ. And when we share the love of Christ, what does it do? It draws people to us. C.S. Lewis stressed in Mere Christianity, if you've never read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, great book, and it's not difficult to read, that he said that Christianity has exceptionally fine credentials on all accounts. And he encourages us to look into them. And it's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. So Alistair McGrath agrees with C.S. Lewis on this. Both men were atheists before their days at Oxford. It's amazing because now what we see a lot of times, people be Christian, they go off to university, and then they become atheists. You know, but if these two guys were atheists, they head off to, you know, one of the world's leading universities, and there were a lot of the world's leading Christians there at the time, and both of them came to a conclusion that not only is Christianity real, I need Jesus. That's what they're doing. So both men were atheists before their days of going up to Oxford. Both understood and understand that you can totally commit yourself to the gospel in full confidence as a powerful, credible, and profoundly satisfying answer to the mystery of human existence. Faith, then, is basically this. It's our final resolve to live with the assumption that there are certain things that are true and trustworthy. And we can have confident assurance that they are true. And that one day we will know with absolute certainty that they are true and they are trustworthy. And as I get older and older, and it's hard to you can't slow it down. You know, this week was announced my retirement from teaching in high school. And I didn't really want an announcement or anything. I just, it's time, but here's the thing. The older I've gotten and the more I've read, does it mean I've gotten rid of all the doubts and everything I don't understand? No, not even close. But here's the one thing I know. I know that I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. And so we know that we will know and we will understand with absolute certainty. Remember, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I love this, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly. But he says, but then, face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. See, all the times, I'm no secret to God. He knows me much better than I know myself. And so I love what Paul says as he says that. So what does that teach us? It teaches us that faith really grows. Faith really does grow. Faith starts out as confidence and trust in God. It rejoices in His presence and in His power. It is often likened to being in love with someone. You want to be with them, and there's a secure feeling with them. My wife and I have been married, I'm not going to say how many years, but we've been married for a long time. And the more we've been married, the more, you know who I want to spend all my time with? I want to spend all the time with her. I mean, why? Because the love has grown and the love is there. And there's no one that I'd rather be with. No one I'd rather be with than with her. So it's often likened to be in love with someone. You want to be with them. Why? There's a secure feeling with them. She knows all my doubts. She knows all my fears. She takes care of me. She prays for me. She knows that. At this point, it can be more emotional rather than intellectual. And when I mean intellectual, I mean just thinking about it. The problem is that many people never get beyond this point in their growth and maturity. So we stay in the level of feeling. There is more to faith than feeling and emotion. Alistair McGrath says, Christianity isn't just about experiencing God, and I like this. It's about sticking to God. Do you remember, at least I remember, when I first got married, and the pastor said, I now pronounce you man and wife. And then what I'd been looking for my whole life, he said, what? You may now kiss the bride. Woohoo! That's good. That was it. That was it. I was hooked, right then. And this is it. You may kiss the bride. But I want to experience those kisses often. Does that make sense? We didn't just kiss the bride once. We over and over again. And guess what? It gets better. It gets better. And that's what sticking to God is all about. It's the same thing. So mature faith then is secure, but faith not deeply rooted will be tempted to find security somewhere else. Why do people leave the faith? Why do people leave Christianity? They're looking for something they think is better or someone else. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27, he says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." You know the story. The rain came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine, Jesus said, and does not put them into practice, he said, is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. So what is faith? Well, it seeks understanding. Faith propels us to seek understanding more about God, more about Jesus, more about human nature and our destiny. And I'm so thankful I go to a church that teaches and preaches these things over and over and at a different level and different. Isn't it wonderful that the kids are back there learning this? See how they're doing it? They're learning it. And you know what? You know why they need to learn it? Every day. Over and over and over again. I think it was John Wooden. John Wooden was asked what the... if you're too young and don't know who John Wooden is, shame on you. You know, John Wooden was the greatest basketball coach of all times, UCLA, and they won all the many different NCAA championships. And they asked him, they said, "What are the laws of learning?" He said, "Well, the people tell you that there are 3 laws of learning. It's instruction, demonstration, and practice." And he said, "No, it's not that." He said, "There's 7. It's instruction, demonstration, practice." And then he said, repetition, 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 repetition. Do it over, do it over, and do it over again. And it's not just the one thing. Why do we read our Bible often? Why should we read it every day? It's repetition, it's repetition, it's repetition. So faith seeks us to faith propels us to seek understanding more about God, more about Jesus, more about the human nature and destiny. It's faith's very nature to seek understanding. So faith roots itself into our minds. And there's a lot of this that, everybody thinks everything goes through the heart, and it does, but it's got to root itself in our minds as we embrace the risen Christ. What does Romans 12 tell us? It says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your minds." To become Christian is to encounter and embrace the reality of God. That's a relationship. To become a disciple is to allow this encounter to shape the way we think and act. So what are our actions? What controls our actions? Our thoughts. So faith then, and this is a good word for us, but faith is obedience. In Romans chapter 1, Paul emphasizes obedience. He says, "Through him and for his name's sake, we receive grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith." Paul is telling us that the way we act is important. Joseph Addison puts it this way. He says, "Faith is kept alive in us and gathers strength from practice more than speculation." And a lot of times people sit around and debate what they're supposed to do instead of just doing it. We need to know. We need to be involved. So faith is, and by the way, our church has many things to get involved in. Oxford writer W.H. Griffith Thomas says it this way: "Faith begins with the conviction of the mind based on adequate evidence. It continues in the confidence of the heart or emotions, which is based on the conviction, and it is crowned in the consent of the will. I know, I do, and I keep doing." And he says, by means of which the conviction and confidence are expressed in our conduct. And hopefully you saw the progression of that, and hopefully it makes, and I think it's absolutely amazing to hear that. So doubts are here to stay. Bad news, okay? Doubt is probably a permanent part of the Christian life. Dr. McGrath likens it to some kind of spiritual growth pain. Think of it as part of the human frailty. Here we are, we're all in this together. But think about how frail our lives are. But not only that, but the way we think. Now, as medical doctors see life as a permanent battle against all sorts of diseases, so seems to be the life of faith as a battle against doubt. So what about doubting the existence of God? Now, this may seem to be a problem only for Christians, but is it? Now, I don't think so. I think it's the other way around too. So do atheists doubt the existence or even the non-existence of God? Do atheists have facts and all we have is faith? Is that the way it is? And the answer is no. Now remember, we started off, and I talked about two scholars. They get to Oxford, and what happens? They become Christian. You know why? A lot of it was because they were Christian friends that were already there, and they see it, that it's real. So do atheists just have the facts, and all we got to lean on is, okay, I'm going to have faith, I'm going to have faith. You know, that's the way we look at it. It's not that way at all. Atheists may claim that we cannot actually prove that God exists, but it is also true that the atheist cannot disprove his existence either. And so here's what I like to do. I like to turn the atheist argument on its head. He said there is no God. Well, prove it to me. Be your apologist for there is no God. You know what they usually do? They start attacking the Bible. I said, I wasn't talking about the Bible. Just tell me about why God doesn't exist. You know, put the onus on them. And so listen to what the atheist Kai Nelson said. Here's what he says. He says, to show that an argument is invalid or unsound. Now, I'm a school teacher, so it's getting a little nerdy right here. I know that. But to show that an argument is invalid or unsound is not to show that the conclusion of the argument is false. All the proofs of God's existence may fail. Get this. This is an atheist talking. But it still might be the case that God exists. Do you hear the doubt in his mind? So this is the idea that, are we the only ones that doubt? And the answer is no. The atheist realizes that the outcome of God's existence, at least for the atheist, is uncertain at best. You know what? If I was going to be uncertain about it, and it was heaven or hell, I think I'd choose heaven. So the idea of doubt penetrates the atheist as well. This means that their belief that there is no God is exactly that. It is a belief. And guess what it's based on? It's based on faith. Now we are reminded, think about this and get this, but the fool has said in his heart, what? There is no God. So, write this title down of a book, okay? I'm just going to give you a book. It's a book that is good for apologetics. But it's called this. It goes right with this. It's called, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Title of the book. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Okay? By Frank Turk and Norm Geisler. Dr. Geisler's in heaven now, and I'm sure he's up there rejoicing and everything else. And the atheist, well, that's another story. But notice what he says. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. You know why? The evidence for Christianity, the evidence for God's existence, the evidence that Jesus really rose from the dead is robust. We've got a lot of it. So if we look at the idea of statements of faith, Alistair McGrath asserts that the simple fact is that when anyone starts making statements about the meaning of life, the existence of God, or whether there is life after death, they are making statements of faith. You can't prove, either by rational argument or by scientific investigation, what life is all about. So whether you're a Christian or you're an atheist, you share the same problem. And that's the idea that we talk about faith, and that's why I love the title of the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. C.S. Lewis often pointed this out. He says, it looks as if God has made us in such a way that we long for Him, and then go and find Him. And then he says this, the desire for God originates from God and eventually leads to Him. Well, thank you for listening. Let's bow for a word of prayer. That's the Lord's blessing. Father, thank you for your love and your grace and your goodness to us. And Lord, I pray that you would watch over us. Lord, thank you for the evidence that you've given us. And Lord, the idea of doubt, how it's a part of our life, part of the way we do things. But Lord, help us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And let us love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our minds. Let's continue in prayer. If you would just